Each of you commissioners have the agenda in front of you, and we will follow it as written. But first, let's take a moment of silence. Okay, thank you. And we'll have the roll call by our vice chair.
Commissioner Deets. Commissioner McMichael.
Present.
Commissioner Sims.
Present.
Commissioner Tolliver. Commissioner Patrick.
Present.
Commissioner Riley Wright.
Present.
Commissioner Williamson. Councilman Johnson.
Present.
Councilman Holmes.
Present.
Commissioner Reynolds. Commissioner McCauley.
Present.
Is there anyone I've missed in our chair?
Present. Okay, thank you. First, I'd like to welcome everyone that's joined us in chamber tonight and those that are listening. Tonight, we're going to have work group presentations. As we move into our presentations tonight, I want to remind everyone how close we are to that end point that we worked so hard for. We've been at this for about 16 months, and good feeling to know that we've actually, in my opinion, have done a yeoman's job in pulling the information together. Our content experts have been working diligently since February to get us to this point. So, so right now, I'd like to recognize our commissioners and whomever has a report to make tonight.
Does the History Committee have a report to present tonight? On genealogy?
Okay. All right, hearing none, I'll now, oh, you do have your report.
Yeah.
They said it was sent
in
today.
the PowerPoint presentation.
Mr. Hollister, do you guys have our PowerPoint?
PowerPoint. It should be loaded up, but we'll check.
Thank you.
See if we can get on the screen.
So I'll take the executive privilege and make an adjustment to our agenda and ask our project manager, Leah Henry, to come up and present the executive summary and recommendations.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Glad to be here with you today, and we're not at the finish line, but we can see it from here. And I see my presentation here, but I'm not sure how it's going to end up there, so, okay.
There we go.
Oh, great, okay. So what I'm going to do this evening is give you a synopsis of the executive summary and recommendations that you will receive in the next few days. We had a few changes we wanted to make before we shared the document with you, but we'll share the recommendations this evening. And also briefly go over kind of what the entire project entails so that you have some context. So, of course, our assignment at the Research Policy and Impact Center of the National Institute for Minority Economic Development was to perform analysis of data and historical documents made available by the city, by staff, by the commission members, and by subject matter experts, and to recommend restorative policies based on this data and research, and produce a final report by September of 2023. So our timeline is about the same. Our official start would be September of 2021. That was when the High Point NAACP proposed a reparations commission, and the High Point City Council adopted a resolution creating the One High Point Commission in February of 2022. So we're now at July of 2023. Work groups and subject matter experts have all submitted their final product, and we are working on a complete final report incorporating all of their work. Later this month and in August, we will have public input sessions and be working towards submitting the final document and all of that ancillary information to City Council for consideration in September. Our progress to date, as I've reviewed, we've gone over, we've gotten a lot of documents. We've gone back and forth with the subject matter experts to kind of ask them for some changes and additions to the work that they've done, given them some feedback. They are this week giving us their final work product. We've looked at what other municipal reparations and restorative policy initiatives have looked like. There are not many. Some of them are ongoing, so we have real-time laboratories of what's working and not working in the field. And now, today, we'll do some presentation of policy recommendations. I will say that in my desire to be brief, I left off some really important policy recommendations, and I want to make sure that I get to those. But the proposed report that you will get in a few weeks will include an executive summary, an introduction, background on both the historical context, slavery, Jim Crow, and discrimination, reparations and reconciliation efforts in the United States, the purpose and process of creating the commission, and then we will take a deep dive into some disparity statistics in High Point and Guilford County, and some specific areas of education for which subject matter experts were engaged: education, housing, health, and economic opportunity. And I will say that in the process of going through this High Point Commission, we've realized that so many of those areas intersect and overlap. We'll look at some possible restorative policy areas and recommendations. We'll look at recommendations for other stakeholders. There are some things that a local municipality cannot do. There are some things that are not appropriate for a local municipality, but there are other community stakeholders, county and state government, philanthropy, community-based organizations, so we will have recommendations for those entities as well. And then we'll also outline topics for further study, because there are a lot of things that have come up in your discussions that we were not able to cover, but in order to create a really comprehensive framework for restorative policies, you would need to look at some of these other issues. So the document will also cover those. And then we'll have some extensive addenda, which will include primary sources, minutes and notes from meetings, and resources for persons that are interested in various topics related to the report. Some of the topics for further consideration that will not have specific recommendations are policing and criminal justice, environmental justice, higher education considerations, remedies that can be brought by the state of North Carolina, city employment and contracting, and legacy industries and employment practices. And by that, I mean some of the legacy industries that really built the city of High Point: textiles, furniture, transportation, things like that. So what did we consider in creating our recommendations? First, we were looking at the exact language of the City Council resolution to ensure that what we produced was in keeping with that resolution. The expressed interest and discussion among commissioners during public meetings, and so we reviewed the recordings of all of the meetings that happened before we were engaged. We looked at best practices gleaned from North Carolina municipalities in similarly sized and situated cities. So we tried to look at cities that were small to medium-sized cities, cities in the southeast, cities that had a similar state legal framework. Then, of course, we had the research from subject matter experts. We looked at city policies and programs that are already in place and under consideration, and we talked to several staff members about what the city is currently doing and has plans for in the immediate future on the topics that we covered. And then we're also looking at city studies and plans. And so, for instance, you have undertaken a long-term comprehensive plan for the city, and we're looking at what's coming out of those first discussions. So before we get to the housing policy recommendations, what I realized that I left off of my slides were two overarching policy recommendations. I'm not sure they're policy recommendations. The first is for the city of High Point to formally apologize for the city's role in supporting and legally supporting both slavery, Jim Crow, and discrimination. So that's something that I know was discussed in the beginning, and we will include examples from other municipalities of apologies. Excuse me. The second recommendation is to create some sort of truth and reconciliation process. And this is because this is an ongoing conversation between the city and its residents, among city residents, and there's a lot of information that most residents of the city may not be aware of. And so we're going to discuss some of the processes that have happened both regionally, for instance, the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission that focused on one specific incidence of violence, two examples that I think are very relevant to the U.S., the Post-Apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was created in South Africa to give everyone a chance to really discuss what had happened during that period of racial oppression. So now we'll move on to housing policy recommendations, and I do apologize for having to really breeze through a lot of these, but I want to make sure we get them all in the time allotted. Our recommendations include targeting your housing development funds that are administered by the city to historically disinvested neighborhoods, to fund assistance to property owners to resolve title issues and secure properties for intergenerational transfers. This one I think is an important one, is often overlooked. Oftentimes local governments spend a lot of time figuring out how to help people purchase homes, but not how to maintain properties that families have already invested in decades or generations ago, but maybe now they're at the point where their title situation is not clear. And not only are folks not able to financially benefit from ownership of that property because of lack of clear title, if they want to come to the municipality for assistance with rehab or other kinds of programs, normally without clear title, you're not even able to take advantage of the things that are already offered. We're recommending that you incentivize development of new housing in targeted neighborhoods, that you create a robust fair housing program to raise the quality and standard of rental property. And then lastly, but certainly not least, to assemble capital to increase housing supply and demand. So with demand, we're talking about down payment assistance, counseling for home buyers, things of that nature. And on the supply side, construction loans and other ways of subsidizing and incentivizing construction. Next, we have economic opportunity and development. We're recommending developing employment and youth training options, such as a youth build program, expanding and creating youth apprentices and summer employment, conducting a disparity study, which you already have in progress, and once again, assembling capital for business microloans and to support social entrepreneurs. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to support people in the community who may have ideas of how they can be a part of addressing some of the issues that have been raised. For health, we're recommending in food deserts, creating incentives for fresh food retailers, urban agriculture, food co-ops, farmers markets, and gardening programs. We're recommending that you support the creation of healthcare hubs and mobile units for racially concentrated areas of poverty and historic African American neighborhoods. And we do have some really good examples in North Carolina of local governments working with hospital systems, county health departments, other things, to bring healthcare into the community. And then we're recommending, and this is one of those that covers a broad range, housing as well as health, investing in green and healthy housing programs, lead and asbestos abatement, mold eradication, and weatherization. Not only are these housing programs, but they're really health programs because they're going to address elevated levels of lead in children, respiratory illness, some of the other things that come with dilapidated and unhealthy housing. For transportation, we're recommending that you create additional routes and expansion of available hours to accommodate travel of people to employment and other services and recreation. And so often, and this is something that came up in community input from your High Point 2045 plan, oftentimes people have a desire to go to a certain place for a job, but the bus route hours and the job hours just don't match up. Prioritize street improvements and repairs in neighborhoods that previously were neglected for maintenance and improvements. And this is really an equity issue that came out of a lot of the review of city council minutes from years past, where certain neighborhoods were favored for infrastructure investments and certain neighborhoods were overlooked. This has an impact on your ability to build housing and attract residents and businesses. And then ensure that your multimodal traffic studies are up to date and prioritizing disconnected people and places. And so while we recommend additional routes and extending the time frame for routes, these may not be the right transportation solutions for your people. But you have to have multimodal traffic studies, and by that, I mean traffic studies that look not only at cars, but at buses, bicycle lanes, and other ways that people can get around, your sidewalks, that kind of infrastructure, and make sure, particularly, that the currently disconnected people and places are being connected to what's going on in High Point. Next, we'll cover education. This has been a challenge for me because while there once was a city school system that did actively engage in discrimination, from everything from school funding to how they paid employees, that system ceased to exist several decades ago, and now it's a Guilford County school system. So we really tried to wrestle with what are the things that a municipality can do that will have an impact on the education system. And while the municipality cannot necessarily impact directly curriculum or things of that nature, you can impact the built environment in which schools operate. And so for those recommendations, we're recommending that you collaborate with your public school system to co-locate housing, community development, and school system investments, both new construction and renovation of school buildings. And what that means is that you want to make sure that your school system has every opportunity and reason to maintain inner city schools that already exist because they are anchors for neighborhoods. And if they are going to build out or in new areas or growing areas, that they're not just building a school, but they're taking the opportunity, since often it's millions of dollars of infrastructure investment and other kinds of work that has to be done on site. How can you have housing and other amenities that really creates a community around a school? And then second, explore ways to ensure that all students and educators have access to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet. So we all knew this was a problem before the pandemic, and then it became very obvious during the pandemic that we shouldn't assume that everyone has access to high-speed internet. And while there are some challenges with local government in North Carolina directly providing that service, we've come a long way. There's a lot of discussion right now at the state level about how to make it happen. And the state is embarking upon a digital equity plan. So they're going to be looking at how to precisely fill the gaps for low-income people in overlooked neighborhoods. And then last, my recommendations for implementation. One is that this is just the beginning. So as many of us have said, it is a marathon, it is not a sprint. And so while you have a set of recommendations, we're recommending that you engage with some partners or consultants to assist you with implementation, to prioritize your actions, to acquire additional resources. And if you work with universities or certain nonprofits, you have a much broader range of sources to finance additional work. We recommend that you ensure that the internal standard practices at the city support interdepartmental cooperation for multi-sector solutions. Many of these recommendations cover different areas of work in different departments. And so it's going to be crucial that your existing staff within the city are encouraged and empowered to work together on these solutions. We're going to recommend that you create a plan to track, evaluate, and report to the community. That seems obvious, but we have to plan for it on the front end in order to make sure that it happens. And then to use what you already have, the people you already have, the plans you already have, and the policies you already have. And I say this because High Point is a dynamic community. You've got lots of resources and great people. You have a great staff. I've worked with them now for 4 months. I didn't know any of them before then, and so I can honestly say that they've got great ideas and they're ready to work. You've got lots of plans and you're in planning processes right now that this work can be incorporated into. And you already have policies in place that can allow you to do a lot of the things that we've recommended. So for our next steps, the Institute team will produce a final report and submit it in July. The report's findings and recommendations will be shared with stakeholders in High Point later this month, July 27th, and then again August 15th. And then we will submit a final report to the High Point City Council in September. After that, the community will choose implementation strategies and assemble the human and financial resources for your success. And that's my presentation.
Thank you.
Do we have time for questions, or should I say? Would you like questions?
From the commissioners, yes. Are there any questions, commissioners?
This is Commissioner McMichael. One of the questions that I had while you were doing the presentation is there any recommendations for when the city is doing bids to target African-American contractors and builders for major projects and make sure that those opportunities are really made known with those individuals who are in those lines of work? Could that be one of the recommendations? And then also, is there a recommendation surrounding development of the inner city by the distribution of property or resources to those community-based organizations that are actually doing the work within that community versus outside organizations coming in? So for example, if we're looking at urban agriculture, or if we're looking at youth programming, is there a way to partner with local churches that are within those communities and pillars of those communities to make sure that they have ways to do development versus the YMCA, the Boys and Girls Club, then coming in and then dominating that space, not allowing for grassroots community building?
So, yes. So the first question was about minority contractors and ensuring that they are participating in the work of rebuilding in the community. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the second is about community-based organizations and ensuring that they have access to resources in order to work in their communities rather than bringing in outsiders. So those are both excellent suggestions, and what I'll say is that the actual document and the explanation is a lot longer than what I did here. So when I said incentivize, for instance, under-incentivize contractors to build in certain neighborhoods, we are actually, as an Institute for Minority Economic Development, 100% committed to ensuring that minority businesses play a crucial role in our economy at large, but particularly in minority neighborhoods. And so I would say that that would absolutely be a part of the litany of recommendations that would come under that heading.
And just for another point of clarification, like gentrification happens so easily because projects like tiny homes and stuff come up, and so they start looking in low-income communities because they have a lot of vacant lots, and so then the city starts giving lots to companies that are doing tiny homes, for example, and then those owners of those tiny home companies doesn't necessarily have it seems like a green way, but if the ultimate home ownership is not with African Americans, or if they're just renting from those tiny home construction persons, then now the community is being used to further the love of others instead of the community itself. So it seems like a better use of resources when distributing property in those communities to avoid gentrification is to really empower the community to own those properties, build those properties, and use African-American contractors to support those efforts. And that's just based on my knowledge of what's happening in High Point,
Okay.
specifically in my zip code, that, making sure that we're not pushing the community out and then moving a different community in.
Okay.
This is Commissioner, Vice Chair Austin Wilson. What I hear Commissioner McMichael saying is allow the people that are in the community, that you are repairing in the community, to do the work in the community.
Right. And so I absolutely agree with that. In fact, one of the reasons that I specifically mentioned the youth build opportunity is because I've seen firsthand in a lot of cities that it's a wonderful way, particularly to engage young adults who live in a certain community in the rebuilding of their own community. And so that was one of the reasons that we specifically mentioned that kind of a program, because it is community-based and it's hiring local people, and they're usually working in their own geographic area. I think I should mention that I did not put on the screen that one of our recommendations is for the city to engage professionals in an audit of the city's policies and procedures currently to ensure that the current policies and procedures are not overtly or inadvertently fostering discrimination or inequities in city contracting and things of that nature. And so your concern about the city providing properties to persons who are going to gentrify a neighborhood would then come under that complete scan of how the city is currently operating its policies and programs.
Can we look at economic development as well and the incentives, the difference in the incentives that they give to North Main Street or as opposed to Green Street? They're significantly different. They're $5,000 to $1 million. If we're going to improve the community, we need more than $5,000 to be able to improve that community on the lines of the $1 million
Okay.
incentive.
This is Councilman Holmes. A couple of things, Commissioner McMichael. The point that you made regarding the transfer of property within the city, those are things that we certainly can look at in terms of community agriculture. There have been discussions with some of those that are currently fighting food insecurity to see if their volume of inventory is enough to facilitate a storefront. If it's not a consistent enough inventory to be able to manage and consistently be a presence in the community, it's very tough to do that. So we're fostering those relationships between those who are urban agriculture purveyors and to be able to have that co-op there so there's a consistent presence. On the other point, in regards to the down payment assistance, all those things, currently we have those things in place. This would be an expansion of some of the policies that are existing. And in terms of incentives, our incentive structure is generally based around the amount of investment. So obviously, if you look at what's happening in North High Point, the investments tends to be larger, therefore the incentive structure tends to be larger as well. So we actually do have a preferential incentive structure if you want to invest in an opportunity zone in the core city. So we try to make it more attractive to be able to invest in areas that have historically not had investment. And so, we're looking at this as an entire ecosystem of economic development across the board. And so, in terms of MWBE, we have to have firms available. So what we'll do is we'll use HUB, which is historically underutilized businesses, and so that will allow us to be able to foster relationships with minority firms, because if they're not here in High Point, then we have to work to develop those firms to get them up to speed to handle the work. So this is where our relationship with Thrive High Point comes in. This is where our relationship with the Chamber comes in, is to identify those who have small businesses and allow them to scale up to be able to meet the work of what the city is doing. Because simply, some of these contracts, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million that run over the course of 2 to 3 years, and if your business is incapable of handling that, then it's very tough for you to win those contracts. And so what we have to do is identify those firms, get them funding, help them scale up, and then put them in the list, in the queue, to be considered for city contracts. So there's a lot of groundwork that needs to take place, but I think we do have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that. But we do have to foster those relationships with minority business owners in the city to get them to come forward, and we have to do our part to meet them where they are, and then grow that relationship and get them in the queue to be considered.
This is Chairman Austin, and I want to remind everyone to make sure that your mics are on when you're speaking. In listening to the comments, we're all on the same page. You know, I've written down several notes, and they were along those same lines, with the bottom line being providing opportunities for African Americans to create generational wealth, however that can happen. But one area of concern of mine is under the housing piece. You know, for years we've heard the story of African Americans in this city and across the nation losing their property to foreclosure and other elements. I'd really like at some point, and that may be the next phase of our work, to really take a deep dive into the past couple of centuries where, and try to identify how people lost their property through foreclosure, and what can we do to remedy that at this point. So, but I really enjoyed the comments that were made. Any other comments, concerns, questions?
Mr. Chairman, I would, this is Councilman Holmes, I would just like to say I'm greatly appreciative of the work that has gone into this. Just point of reference for the final report, I think while the recommendations speak to what we want to do, I think we really have to make clear to the community how we arrived at these recommendations. So needs to be a data-driven account of disparate impact to our community to really drive home the point how deep and pervasive these policies and their impact were. So I'm looking forward to that final report to be able to say, this is where we started, this is why this was such a necessary endeavor, these are the recommendations, and then this is how we move forward. You know, because there's going to be some things that we're able to do immediately, and this is also going to be a long stretch of kind of re-tilling the soil of our communities so that we can regrow, you know, what was taken from us. So thank you all, subject matter experts and staff, for your work on this.
You know, as you can see, you know, we're at that final push, and we're at the point where we're trying to refine the report. And we want to make sure that we actually stated this in the very beginning. We want to make this a report and a document that will not sit on the shelf and gather dust, that action will be taken. And it's up to us, and more so up to the citizens of High Point to make sure these things happen. And to your point, Commissioner Holmes, yes, we do have to make sure that the information is out there and that people are fully aware of how we derived at these recommendations and the impact that it's had on, the general public as a whole, but more so the African-American community and those marginalized communities. So as we move forward, any comments that cannot be incorporated into the final report will be noted for possible consideration as the city develops this work further. And thank you, Ms. Henry, for that presentation.
This is Commissioner McMichael. Is there a plan to continue the commission after recommendations are made to be an ongoing part of city work? Or is this, like, once the recommendations, or is that something that could be in the recommendations, is that this commission is an ongoing work in progress, and maybe commissioners rotate out or something like that, where the city has a constant lens of DEI that is pushing the agenda of equity versus this being the end, and the recommendations are then presented to city council, and then we have to go through another process. So is there a way to make this an ongoing, yeah,
Yeah, who's going to audit the process?
right?
The process through.
This is Councilman Holmes. I'll field that one. I think there is an opportunity. I think in the proposal, there was a recommendation for future work, because this is the recommendation portion. There's going to need to be an implementation phase. And so that's also going to need to be managed. So whether it's a commission or whether subject matter experts, consultants are brought on to work with staff, this implementation is going to have to be managed. So it will be up to council to say, if there's a recommendation that we maybe not have a full commission, but maybe have a citizens advisory group that continues to work with the council and maybe the consultant that's brought on for implementation, that's possible. But this work is going to have to be managed, the implementation of that from the future. And it may go through different committees. Recommendations may be split up, maybe go through, public, the Prosperity and Livability Committee or Finance, or wherever it may be, Public Safety. They may be split up and done that way. But I think the preferable way would be to comprehensively take these recommendations and move them forward in some commission style.
I just also, this Commissioner Michael, I just worry about, as administration changes, there being a resistance to the movement that has started in terms of that. So I just want to make sure that we're aware that as we're making recommendations and we're going to city council, that while the recommendations are important to go before city council, that a bigger recommendation might be to continue the work. Because we can pass a recommendation for a lot of implementation, but if there's not an ongoing lens that challenges the systemic oppression of policy and practice, then there's no way to really deconstruct it. It was just an opportunity in a moment in space on administration, but as administration changes, we have to be mindful that we want this work to be consistently ongoing, and we talk about it being ongoing, but we have to understand that this is coming to an end. And if we don't see the end of this coming and plan for that in our conversation and what we're moving forward, then this is just a document that then becomes a historical moment and not a historical movement.
There you go.
And I would say that no one has more control over that than the voters.
Right, well, and that's why I feel like as a commissioner, while I have the ability to speak and to move the commission in a certain mindset, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as commissioners, that we've devoted this time and we've been a part of this dais for this time, and I want to make sure that the work that I've done is not something that then I walk away from and then there's no more conversation, because this stuff dies out once it's out the media and once there's no attention to it.
So this is Chairman Alston, and each meeting we talk about the future and where this is going. We've also talked about change happens from within. And it's up to us as citizens and as voters to make sure that the right council is in place. We have that opportunity in November to either continue or make changes that are necessary. But as far as the work of this commission and moving forward, I honestly think that we should have a community organization or group formed specifically to deal with reparations in the city, but not just the city and the county, because they intersect each other. And in doing so, partner with the city and the county in getting change or making change or the opportunity for change. But I've said time and time again, if you're scared, this isn't the work for you. So I would hope with all the work that the commissioners that are sitting here today have put into this, that we lead the drive to continue making sure that our recommendations are heard and that this document does not sit on a shelf and gather dust.
Commissioner McMichael, as a community advocate, it's so imperative with the voter suppression movement that's happening, and I get votes and all of that, but there has to be a way that one of the recommendations could be to continue this work, because the work that we have as community advocates is tireless, and it's being made more and more difficult, from Supreme Court rulings to this work is not being valued from a Supreme Court level. And so my concern is that at a city level, it will die out with a community-based organization that doesn't have the infrastructure or the financial wherewithal to really push an agenda forward. And it seems to me that the major recommendation, and this is just me, and please chime in, y'all, that the major recommendation is that the city has a lens on all commissions and on policy and practices that are written to have a community advisory board that is knowledgeable and educated and a part of the equity and inclusive society that by creating the single most livable, safe, and prosperous community in America, that we're able to say High Point is dedicated to this, and this is how we're going to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to win.
Yes.
This is Commissioner Austin Wilson. I have a lot of different questions and concerns, I do. But one of them is, if you take a street, Commissioner Patrick was talking, she's doing a fundraiser, something out in the community the next week. And she mentioned Furlough Street, White Oak, Able Street, Green Street. How is this going to change that? How is what we're talking about right here going to change? You may not be able to give a repair to a house that is already, it's nothing to pass away to another generation. They don't have sidewalks. How are we going to build infrastructure, again, to change the dynamics? When you said food insecurity, I'm skipping now to food insecurity, you said the people you're having conversations. Who are you having conversations with about food insecurity, and do they look like us?
Yes.
Because I'm not in the conversation, and I'm just curious to know, who are you having conversations?
Yeah, these are preliminary conversations with folks like Grodega,
They don't look like us.
Well, here, Commissioner Austin, I think what we don't need to get caught up in right now is we've got the recommendations. Now we've got to build the resources. You know, some of the folks that are doing active work these are conversations in broader sense of, hey, who are the potential folks that we can bring to the table? Now, this is going to have to be a comprehensive solution, and we can't be insular in our ability to address this problem. So if there's someone who just happens to not look like us but can also help us solve the problem, I think the optimum point is, how do we solve the problem? And not do we just solve the problem with us, because I think in the broad sense of terms, we have got to foster a litany of resources into our community. So, look, I understand the sentiment that you're going for, is that, yes, ultimately, this is a economic self-sufficiency bill.
Self-sustainable.
Self-sustaining, self-sufficiency bill. And so that also does not mean that it is exclusive to just our community, because we're going to have to pull in resources from the banking sector, from the public sector. Some of those folks don't look like us. Are we going to exclude resources simply because they don't? I think that is cutting off our nose to spite our face. So, you know, preliminary conversations just happen to happen with folks who are doing the work in those communities, but it's only the beginning conversations. So those will broaden out, and we will bring every conceivable resource to the table to be able to solve the problems. But, hey, you know, I certainly understand, you know, our reticence, but we cannot, at this point, very close to the finish line, trip ourselves up by semantics. And so I just will, to the council, continue to have an open mind, because we cannot tie our hands in a work this broad.
This is Commissioner Austin Wilson. I want to be really clear. That is our challenge. When you say semantics and check that I'm not speaking semantics. I understand that we have a problem and we need to come up with a solution. I'm not saying deprive our people any longer with the solution. They've already been deprived. We're here right now being deprived. I'm asking that the solution be taking care of people that do look like us. If there's not a resource, build the resource up so the person can look like us. I'm not saying exclude. We've already been excluded. If they were going to step in, they can step in. I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's make sure and be mindful. We're people in the room that have experienced exclusion.
I certainly.
I'm just trying to make sure that the conversation is that there are people in the room that do look like us, that do have the opportunity for you to put the funds in their hands to be able to be self-sustainable in our community. The problem is in our community is that we are waiting on some white person to come and save us or help us. We need to be self-sustainable. I'm just trying to make my own point clear. You don't have to have anything to say after it. I'm just trying to make sure that we understand that our community needs to be self-sustainable, and we need to feed our own people. We need to build our walkways. We need to build new houses and new infrastructure.
No, I think we're agreeing. I just think in terms of our understanding of the short, medium, and long-term effects, we just have a difference of opinion. Because if we do not have those folks who are readily available, who can step in to provide that resource, should we put that off until they're ready?
It's already been put
No.
off.
And so what I'm saying is if there's an organization who can come in while we build the infrastructure, and I think I said that earlier, is when we're talking about the instruction or the construction of firms, if they are not available, we are going to invest in building these up so that they can become part of the long-term solution. But in the short run, should we continue to deprive if we have a resource that just does not happen to look like us? I think that's short-sighted.
Generational wealth, and that's the way we're going to, 9 times out of 10, be able to get to our generation. We're talking about generational wealth,
Yeah, and trust me,
not giving generations to another group that have already
and that's-
sailed.
Commissioner Wilson, that's not what we're proposing here.
Okay.
What we're proposing is that this is a long-term economic development plan. In the short run, there may be a organization while we're building up internal resources. And so just continue to think about in the short, medium, and long term, this is economic development. You have to have resources to be able to get these things started if you do not have the resources from within the community that you need. And that's just a simple economic theory.
This is Commissioner McMichael, and to that point, that's why I feel like the recommendation, so when funding is being distributed to agencies that have the ability to impact low-income communities, then there needs to be some sort of agreement with that community and that agency that they're not just receiving a service or a program, but there is some real estate investment, that there is some property restorative, because if you bring in an agency to help me, but then my house is still dilapidated or my building is still falling down, then you've only helped me temporary. But if you take some of those fundings to build up infrastructure that they're getting for programming, right? So we spend a lot of money on programming and not real estate. And the money and the generational transfer of wealth is in real estate and property ownership and land ownership. So we have to do both. And I hear, and I agree, I also feel like there needs to be some stipulations with the distribution of money. And for those who have the infrastructure to say, you need to be committed to this as well, because they're going to benefit from, if you eliminate poor black people, then all of the white organizations that help poor black people cease to be wealthy. So there's this consistent oppression with programming and services that if you take kids out of foster care, then the money that funds the foster parent, that funds this is we have gone from chattel slavery to an economic empire from disenfranchisement, and we just have to figure out how do we. And I believe we're on the same page.
We are.
This is just a conversation that needs to happen on record so that people understand that we are intelligent sitting up here and that we understand the powers that be and what needs to happen in order to change. And it's really not that hard to change. It's as simple as rewriting policy and practice and sticking to it. We shouldn't have to make a recommendation for something that we know is blatantly racist. If we have to make a recommendation to change a racist policy, then that means we're not acknowledging that the policies and practices are racist. So we have to be smart. It's like if a genie gave me one wish, what am I going to wish for? I'm going to wish for unlimited wishes.
That's right. That's right.
Because for me, I thought about that thing. And for me, it's like I need the ability to keep wishing. And if I waste my wish on love in America, it may not get me where I'm trying to go. So I need a wish after my first wish and after my third and fifth wish. So my point is, if we make one recommendation that can dismantle and deconstruct, then I'm willing to do that versus 20 that's going to put us back in the loophole for another 20 years.
This is Commissioner Riley Wright. It's all right, McMichael. So I am so in agreement with so many things, and one of the things that I'm totally in agreement with is that one of our recommendations is definitely that somehow this type of commission or some type of organization or committee remains in place, because what I hear is, oh, the voters are going to do it, oh, the people are going to do it. We have to have somebody, some organization in place, because if it was that easy, the city of High Point would have corrected many things prior to this, because they've said it before. Now we have to have something in place that says we're going to keep it going.
Well, I mean, I don't think that is an unreasonable request. I think that we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
I think what we're saying is that there has to be some type of oversight of implementation. So we can't just bring the recommendations to bear. We have to, if we're looking at this as a project, as we bring forth the scope of the project, we bring forth the recommendation, and then we have someone that implements the policies. And yes, there are going to be some delineations from specific aspects of this that may go through the city, but overall, there needs to be a project manager that continues to implement this. Now, whether it comes from within the city staff That will also be part of the recommendations that we look at. What are the man hours? What's the best way to go forward? But certainly, I think Ms. Henry put it in there, is that potentially there's going to be a continuation of the management of implementation. And I think that was in one of her slides. So I think we've been talking about this for 15 minutes, and it was already in the slide about the implementation phase.
And I hear that, and I'm sure this is Commissioner Riley, right? I'm sure my issue, my concern is when I hear certain words before other statements, it confuses me.
Sure.
So when I hear the word potentially, it doesn't say to me that we're going to. It says we might, and I don't like mights. Either we are or we aren't. Is that what we're really trying to do, or we're not? But when I hear potentially, and no slight to you, Ms. Henry, at all. When I hear the word potentially, it says to me, I ain't sure, I might. It's a
I think in the context of this, potentially was the form it would take. So it could potentially be from city staff, it could potentially be a future consultant. I think ultimately, there's going to have to be. There's going to have to be.
Just so you know, you messed me up again. You said, I think.
No.
Ultimately.
No.
You did not say, yes, it will be. That's the problem.
There's going to have to be resources to continue implementation. There's no other way for this to happen and not be lost.
And I don't think that person should be a city staff person.
Well,
I feel like if we,
That's not even.
it just creates a blurred line when you have to play this game with the city. And not that person needs to have agency to speak truth to power. And when you don't have the agency to speak truth to power, that's the beauty of being able to sit up here right now. Because y'all not paying me, right? And so if I put somebody off, that's all it is. That person needs to be empowered to present things in a way that keeps them separate from their livelihood. Because what I realize in this community is that you speak too much and you can be cut from your resources. And I say what I say.
And this is
Turn your mic off,
Chairman
Mike.
Austin, and we've experienced that during the 16 months that we've been working. The city staff has done a yeoman's job in assisting, but they had their limitations, you know. So I go back to there has to be an entity created that can move this forward. Now, however that looks, we'll visit that at that point. But this work will continue, and this conversation will continue, so.
Excuse me, this is Commissioner Sims, and maybe I missed something, but what are we going to recommend with, how do we target and identify who will receive these resources of reparations? Because we're talking about how we're going to get it to them, but who we're going to get them to. Because I think I read this is for the descendants of slaves, correct? How are we going to identify who gets the resources?
No, I'm sorry. In order for us to be able to do that, we would have to take the lineage-based approach, which we decided that we were not going to do. This is a policy where we could target specific neighborhoods, specific housing, areas of housing, and then focus those resources there. But in terms of having a direct population, that's not what these policies are, because these policies change for the entire city. These are policies that will have, these are economic policies that will have an outsized impact on racially concentrated areas of poverty. And that just happens to be Black people. But we cannot specifically say that these policies can't benefit in Asian folks who happen to live in 27260, where there's poverty. So I think, just so that we're not confused, this is a policy-based initiative
Well, it's not a reparations, and I said that before.
Well, I think, Commissioner Wilson, that we established that we were not taking a federally based reparations approach because it just wasn't appropriate and feasible for the city of High Point. And so what we're looking at is long-term systemic change to the systems that have deliberately and negatively impacted communities. And so I think we established that when we wrote this policy, the initial policy prescription, that we were not going to take the federal reparations route, similar to San Francisco and other places.
This is Chairman Austin, and to your point, Commissioner Sims, that's a conversation that we'll have to continue. You know, that we will have to continue that. So therefore, this lives on.
Yeah, because there's some ancestors going to be real upset about that.
Okay, so, and then, well, let me get Mr. Ratchford.
Chairman Nelson, I just have a few things that I'd like to say in reaction to our conversation tonight.
Is your mic on?
Is your mic on? Okay, is that better? Okay, I just wanted to make a few comments in reaction to all of the conversation that I've heard tonight. And let me say, first of all, that this is really great conversation. What you all have proved through your conversation tonight is that once you get into doing this work, this stuff is going to be hard, it's going to be complex, it's going to be complicated, it's going to be multi-layered, and it's going to be hard. It's not going to be an easy fix. Your project manager reminded you all on several occasions, including tonight and previously, that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and it's not going to happen overnight. In reaction to some of the things that I heard, Commissioner McMichael had asked the question, is there a role for this commission after the report has been submitted? Based on my recollection, there's nothing in any of the written materials that calls for that, but that does not mean that it doesn't have to be. You all can think of a role, and if you get the right people to agree to that, that can actually happen. If you all are thinking about what you might do, in Charlotte, I do work around fair housing, and we get a respondent and a complainant together, and we come up with a negotiated settlement agreement, which should be the end of the process, but it's not. Someone has to monitor that agreement, and someone is going to have to monitor these recommendations to make sure that they do, in fact, get implemented, or that somebody acts on them. So that could be the role that you all actually play. It is about accountability and monitoring to make sure that actually happens. Earlier, in response to what Commissioner Austin Wilson and Commissioner McMichael said, what I heard is you all acknowledging that if we were to give people of color in this community access to capital in the same way that white people have access to capital, the local economy could blossom 10 times what it is, and everybody benefits from that. Everybody, regardless of your identity, benefits from a larger economy if everyone has the same access to capital. All of you have spoken out tonight, and I've heard my brother here talk about, we're saying the same thing, and he's right, you all are saying the same things, but I'm not quite sure that you're listening to one another. So I will remind you of something that Winston Churchill once said, when he said, courage is what it takes to stand up and speak out. And you all have stood up and spoke out, but courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. And I'm not sure that you all are as good on the listening part, so you really do need to start listening to one another, and you will realize that you are, in fact, saying the same things. This work getting done is about speed, the speed of how it gets done. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. It may take 10, 15, 20, it may take 50 years, but you've got to get started somewhere. You've got to get started somewhere. You all have done yeoman's work. Not only has the people over here have done great work in yeoman's work, but you all have done yeoman's work. You've been at this for a year, going on a little over a year now. Initially, your eyes were not on the prize because we had too much yin stuff, but once you got over that, look at how much you have accomplished from that point up until tonight. Always keep that in mind. You all are going to be fine, but this process and the final analysis is going to require monitoring and accountability. Someone has to look over it to make sure that it does, in fact, happen. Accountability is the key. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Henry.
Thank you, Chairman Alston. I just wanted to address a couple of things that have come up for clarification. First, on the future of the commission, I did want to mention that, to my recollection, the resolution calls for the sunsetting of the commission either 60 or 90 days after the presentation in September. So if one wanted to continue it, then time is of the essence. I also wanted to speak to the issue of how do you target the persons who would be recipients of the opportunities, the policies and programs that would be implemented. And it's always an issue when you are trying to use government money to do this level of targeting. Typically, unfortunately, residential segregation works in our favor. And by that I mean, if you recall previous presentations, when you looked at heat maps of disparities in life expectancy, negative health outcomes, all manner of disparity issues, it was mostly the same places on the map. And so one of the recommendations that will be in the full report that we didn't discuss tonight was for the city to designate specific targeted redevelopment areas. And that's a particular process that a city would, that, like High Point, that receives HUD funds annually, would go through to say, these areas that have concentrated poverty and dilapidated housing and some other things, we're going to specifically target these neighborhoods to do increased investment and activities in. Unfortunately, there's a strong correlation between the African American community or predominantly African American community in some of those spaces. And so those are the ways, a lot of times, that local governments will be able to target the group of people that you're interested in, African Americans, without saying we're doing this program for African Americans. So that's one of the ways that you do it. Ideally, if you want to go further than that, that's where you're looking towards philanthropy and other private sources who can do things with their funds that a municipality cannot do. And so we'll cover all of that in detail in response to your concerns.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we're going to move on. On July 27th, we're having a call meeting, and we will pick this conversation up, I'm sure, at that meeting. And prior to that, each of the commissioners will have an opportunity to get a copy of the executive summary and those recommendations, be able to read and dissect it so that when we come in, we will be in a mode of refining the final product. And I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the future. I'm really excited about that.
This is Commissioner McMichael, and I won't be here on the 27th. So one final point, as I've just been sitting here to think about how we target zip codes and residents in zip codes, one of my concerns that was just raised in me is if we don't own those properties, then who benefits from the services? So if the homeowners are not people that look like us, but they're renting to people who look like us, then that targeted neighborhood only allows for economic wealth to be poured back into the people who made it disparate, and then also to the hard work and all of that. One of the things that this commission, I feel, has done really well is listened to what needs to happen, and now we're in a place that we only have a few months to respond. So you will hear a lot of talking from us as commissioners, as we need to make sure that we're doing our job as commissioners to really move this agenda along, because we have experts content experts, we have city council persons, we have city staff, and we want to make sure that we're a part of that process in order for this process to be valid and for the community to buy in, because the community buy-in is very contingent upon the individuals who are sitting up here so that they can trust this process. And I feel like I want to make sure that our involvement is supportive of the work of council, of city staff, of content experts, because when this room is full of community people, we need to be able to answer questions in a way that is not defensive, that is not, that does not tear down and make people feel like they're insignificant because they can't pay their mortgage or because they lost their house. And sometimes I don't feel that we understand how hard this work is from this perspective, because not only are we living it, but we're trying to deconstruct it. And we're putting a lot on the line by making these comments, public comments, recorded comments, for everyone to scrutinize, criticize, and then say what we haven't done. So I want to be clear, and I will make sure that I read the executive summary and provide some feedback prior to, and I appreciate everybody's work. My comments are in no way to make anybody feel insignificant or whatever. It is always to speak truth to power and make sure that my representation on this commission is representative of the congregation that I pastor and the people in the neighborhoods that I live in. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so the next point on the agenda is to review the video project. But before we do that, I want to publicly thank Commissioner Pastor McMichael for opening up his facility, Greater New Hope Baptist Church, to allow us a venue to do or to film these videos. So having said that,
Mr. Chair, good evening. Jerron Hollis, Managing Director, City of High Point. We're ready to talk briefly about this video project. I didn't know if we were going to go back. We had the queue up for the subcommittee report out. We can have them take that down if just whatever order you want to go in. I just didn't want to go in the order that you didn't.
do you want to go through?
Genealogy.
So if our folks can get that
We're
subcommittee
limited on
slide on.
time. Would you like for us to just briefly kind of highlight it? as best
There
we
were some
can?
slides. I'll be glad to drive, but we've got the slides up that it's up to you.
Well, all right. Well, genealogy, that was our subcommittee. That was me, Robert, Commissioner Riley Wright, Commissioner Williamson, and Commissioner McCauley. And as you saw, Jerome went past it too fast.
Sorry.
So, as you saw, one of the first things I wanted to say, and I really want to make this still clear, because it is clear that the struggle was real and the struggle still is real, because the struggle's not yet gone. So, just wanted to make sure I said that part. And Faye, please don't forget to jump in with me.
Okay, I'm with you.
Right. So one of the things that when we went through we went through and tried to look at some history. We tried to look at some slave deeds, and we're not going to go through this whole thing because that's like 37 slides, so we're going to go through it kind of quickly because I think we're crushed on time. Is that correct, Sir Chairman?
Yes.
Okay. So, and one of the things that we found out is there was a lot of information we really couldn't find. We could actually find people and knew that there were people in the city of High Point that were enslaved and that are buried here as slaves, but we had a difficult time finding some of their deeds. We had a difficult time finding who those owners were, and we looked in numerous places trying to locate that information. So, and some of the reasons, of course, is that very often when slaves were brought to the community, their last names changed. Sometimes their first names change. Their families were separated. And the beginning of this is probably more to help you sort of visualize what it may have felt like to be a person brought to this community, not of your own will, and then separate it from everybody and everything that you knew and still survive. It actually speaks to how strong we are as a people. So I kind of talked about that being brought here. And the hardest part for me, some of this was very hard for me, because as I dug into things, I think my feelings got hurt. I may have gotten traumatized just an ounce. I didn't like the fact that people that look like me could be sold like cattle, that they were branded, that they were beaten. I didn't like any of that. So, but as we continue to dig, and that I could be nameless, actually. I could be Janet today and Sue tomorrow based on what my owner says I am and not who I am. So, and just looking at things like the shackles and the chains and the just inhumane treatment that was sometimes different. And often we found out that there were poor records, if not no records at all. And definitely one of the things I feel like we found out in this community is their records, they're just hidden records. So you really got to look for them. They might be in some people's Bibles, they might be in some people's closets, but there's some records somewhere. But it also made it very difficult to trace people all the way back, because you can't find where they were born, you can't find where they really lived, and High Point wasn't really High Point. And I think Faya speak to that.
Yes, there were a lot of different challenges, and part of those challenges were the facts of so many name changes, so many places changes, the border lines changing. How many of us knew that Guilford County used to go all the way to Virginia? And so when you've got records that reflect Guilford County and slavery that happened in Guilford County, that's not the Guilford County High Point that we're talking about today necessarily, but maybe it is. So that's part of the challenges. One of the challenges that we have, of course, is High Point is one city, 4 counties. Another thing with the county lines changing, and I'm sorry, I didn't say, I'm Commissioner McCauley. But High Point is the only city in North Carolina that has 4 counties. And so the lines changed. As I said, Guilford County went all the way to Virginia. Then Rockingham came out of that. Randolph came out of that. So even counties that are here today are no longer part of it. And so it just made a lot of the research much harder. But you can go back all the way to 1750 when this area was settled, but High Point wasn't incorporated until 1859. But there are records of slaves being here prior to that establishment of 1859. High Point was just this mile this way, mile that way, you know, north, south, east, and west. And so at that time, how do you identify who the slaveholders were as well as who the slaves were within basically a 2-mile radius, north, south, east, and west? That's difficult, but we've got records. And so these next few slides show you some of the changes that took place as far as the maps. The first one shows you 1750, when it was people settled in the area. Then within 20 years, it was changed again. That's when Guilford County first came into being. If we'll go on to the next slides, it changes again. Now Randolph's part of it. And then you start seeing, you know, where Rockingham's out of Guilford County and other parts. If we go a little further, then, you know, Davison comes into it. And then in 1849, we've got, you know, Alamance and Orange and, you know, all this other in this same little area that was Guilford County from the beginning. Okay, so now we got 1859. Okay, we got High Point. High Point in Guilford, Randolph, Forsyth, and Davidson County. Okay, The 1965 was the last change in the state maps and counties. So that's where we are now. So, as I said, this made it a lot harder for us to even know where we're looking, who we're looking at. Where were those acres of lands that the slaveholders held? You know, so it made it a very large challenge, and it's hard. We have been told by some people, oh, we can't find it. You can't find it, but we know because of some of the information we were able to find that in those early settlements, there were slaveholders in this area, and they didn't just go away when High Point became incorporated.
And at one point, when I think the committee realized that a lot of the information was hidden, was that we actually looked in the Journal of Negro History. And in the Journal of Negro History, you see the counties listed, but you don't see Guilford County listed with the names of who the slave owners were. Guilford County is not in that listing. So I just thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I just kept going back to look. But there is actually not in there with its list of who its slave owners were.
But as you see in this documentation in High Point history, in 1859, there was a report given in July of 1859, and it listed that there were 525 people in High Point. And it listed that of those, there were 71 families, 160 white males, 281 white females. How about 70 slaves? You had 14 free Negroes, but
Where could they go?
yeah, where did they go? And were they always free? You know, freedom was a fluid thing. Part of the thing that happened also with having the issues with finding the people was extradition. The question was just asked, where did they go? State laws, and these are just two examples of in Duplin County and Davie County, where if you were to become free, you had to leave the state. We've got an example where people felt like, and you know, of course, we know the situation of where there was a gentleman from another state that caused some folks to be concerned because of the organization of slaves, former slaves, and so that became an issue in history. But then we've got a situation where there were residents who felt like they had a good slave, who was a family man, who they felt like deserved to be free. And they were asking the state, because this is a good man, he's done well, can we let him stay where his family is? And if you look at the result, it's unfavorable.
No.
Had to go. Can't stay here. Might cause problems because other people might want to have that idea of freedom. Okay? This is a situation in Guilford County is an example of, you know, how folks were treated. We can go on to the next. I tried to, with some of these slave petitions and deeds, to trace and figure out where some of these families went and who they were. It was hard because, like I said, some of them had to even leave the state. But this was a situation where this was another family. It was a situation of inheritance. So it was one person passing the slave to the next and the next generation type thing like that, and 3 generations of owners being involved in this situation. But it was where somebody had willed the wife and the husband to their mate, and upon her death, they were supposed to be set free. Oops, they had a baby before she died, or he died, And so now the child was going to be a slave as well. Well, then it was supposed to be, hopefully the children and the parents would be together, but, oh no, they had another baby, and after she died, and now the next generation, they're trying to decide on, do we want to set any of them free? You know, they're having to go through, not only did I not win my freedom when the owners died, which was supposed to have happened, but now the children will also have the opportunity to be enslaved. And so then it was a situation of, can we get them, you know, let's set them, if we decide to give them freedom, send them away, send them out of North Carolina. This situation here is from 1774 to 1826. These pages you're looking at, there are a total of 257 slave deeds that we were able to find. Now, as I said, slavery didn't go away when High Point was established, but it does list slave owners, the ones who sold and the ones who bought, and it lists some of the slaves. Now, you don't know if the names stayed the same or changed with the owners, but this is part of the challenge.
Go back. What's the names?
Some of the names you're saying?
I'm just looking.
Oh, you're just getting a chance to review it. And this, yeah, I mean, if you want further information on this, this came from Gifford County Slave Deeds. If you go to their website, you can find this information on their slave deeds with the People Not Property records as well with the University of North Carolina, UNCG. So we can go to the next. Okay. This is just an example of another bill of sale for Nathan Hunt, who was owned by Clarence Tomlinson and sold for $88. Okay, we can go to the next. Church together, you know, so often and I've heard it said in my lifetime more than once, on Sunday morning, 10, 11 o'clock, the most segregated hour in the United States. That didn't always exist like that. Sometimes you were forced to go to church with your owner. It would help with obedience, you know. The owners could help feel good about, I'm giving them a Christian or whatever, you know, giving them faith and different things like that. But you could keep an eye on them during that hour too, or whatever time that church service took. But, you know, there's always been in history a slave Bible, you know, that talks about servants be obedient to your master. But it didn't talk about the things that happened, like when you had a servant who, like Moses, who was rebellious and confronted the masters and the folks over him. So there were two different Bibles, actually, in history. Religion, as I said, was often used to keep the slaves obedient, while the owners were allowed to sometimes forget that golden rule of treating others as you'd have them treat you.
So this is Commissioner Riley Wright, and I guess I'll jump in about right here. We can go on past this particular slide and probably the others too, because we know that we're tight on time. But just wanted to get maybe to the slide where you see Miss Annie Pitts. And what it talks about, there's a list of people that are buried here in the different High Point cemeteries that were slaves. And it's very difficult to find all of their information, but these were slaves that once were a part of this High Point community. So we just need probably more time to dig into that a little bit more, find them somewhere, wherever they are. But we know that we're tight on time, and so that's why we're going to kind of go through as many of these as we can.
Yeah, but let me not completely go quite that fast.
Okay.
I realize we're tight on time, But, right, the ones that she had you skip were, I several meetings ago mentioned how it was hard to find them. And there was a Westminster community that I could find some in, but I wasn't sure. We couldn't find Westminster community in High Point. Those slides she just went through several, 3 or 4 of them ago, I found Westminster. It was in High Point. It no longer exists, but I found those were examples of some of the families that were here in 1870. Some of them were together, some of them weren't. But that was 4 slides that showed the examples of some of the High Point, and some of them were born like in 1859. So it's a good chance that they were actually born here in High Point when it was first established.
What did the Bentley people have to do with it? 1730
Yeah,
North Main Street.
do you know Bentley, there's 62 Bentleys in North America. High Point has the very first one, the oldest one in North America.
Who owns it?
I heard this last year, the ownership has just recently changed, so I can't say the name of who it is right now. I just found that out last Sunday. But I did hear it, yeah, it's a different person. And someone told me it's an African-American for once. But, yeah, but that speaks to some of the difference in High Point. You know, why would a company decide this is the first place like that? And that's one of the first things you see when you come in High Point and notice as far as the difference.
So we tried to rush through this because we really did, and probably didn't give it quite the justice that it should have had. But one of the reasons that we went through it, of course, is because we're trying to get to the end. And I did want to point out that the Underground Railroad did travel through High Point as well to pick up and assist in freeing of slaves, because that was a part of the history of High Point as well. But we just want to be able to go from free-ish to true freedom from what our ancestors have contribute to this community. We want to be acknowledged for the full contribution of the slaves in the city of High Point, correcting policies, housing, development, proper care for Black communities, appropriate salaries and opportunities for the Black communities, just addressing all the needs of the Black community based on their requests and their needs. We had a lot of different places that we looked and a lot of different information that we went through, and that's how we gathered our information. We'd like to thank everybody for their time. We're sorry that we had to rush, but I hope you gained something from this.
And the PowerPoint is a great document. If anybody would like a copy of it, we can provide you with a copy of this PowerPoint. Email it to you.
I did a great job.
I'd like to thank this committee for a great presentation and the work that they did. Now we'll move on to the video project, and then we'll wrap this up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know that I'll get applause after this one, but I will be brief. So I want to echo something that you said. I wanted to thank Pastor McMichael, not only for the use of his church, but even for one of the interviews, he allowed us to use his office. So we want to thank you for allowing us. We mentioned to the group before that the staff had wanted to try to find a way to feature something at the August 15th community meeting that's going to be at the theater. And so I want to thank all of the commissioners that were able to participate in the video project, and also include many of our subject matter experts and some folks from the community. We have approximately 9 hours of footage and have done over 17 interviews over the last 3 weeks. And what this is supposed to do is to provide sort of a backdrop as the final recommendations that are going to be approved by the commission are presented to the community at the August 15th meeting, there will be a production that helps the community understand why this project is important, helps understand the connection of the individual commissioners, the people in the community, and the subject matter experts to this work. So we are in the final phases, and we expect to have something by the end of the month that you all can view and see. But the overall goal is to have it displayed at the August 15th meeting at the theater, which will be following your commission meeting, which will be following the public comment period on the 27th. You'll notice also in front of you, we've included just some upcoming events, cards. We've got some more of those. We can get more if you need to pass those out to people in the community. And that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Hollis mentioned some of the upcoming events that we will be participating in the next few weeks, with the most important one being on July 27th, when we have the public comment meeting. So we'll be meeting here in Chamber at 6:30 on the 27th. And beyond that, yeah, right here.
This is Commissioner Austin Wilson. I just want us to be a little mindful. I always say that we throw out these big and broad ambiguous words that people have given us to speak, but when we say slaves, it's because it's our point of entry is what we know to call slaves, slave owners, and all of that, and plantations. If we can make a better effort, instead of calling our ancestors slaves, because they weren't our slaves, they were those people's slaves, we could call them our ancestors. And we could take slave out of our mouth and put ancestors in our mouth, because we're doing them a disservice by calling them something that they never were. It never should have been. So instead of us having slaves, let's have ancestors. That's all.
Okay, once again, I'd like to thank the commission for another very informative meeting. I'd like to thank our project manager, Ms. Henry, for the great job that you've done, and our content experts, the city staff, for being on point with what you're doing, and in order to not miss a group, I don't want to start naming groups, like NAACP, for creating this effort, and City Council, with our two commissioners actually behind the scenes, really working to help move this forward. One last thing I'll say is that in November, we must go to the polls. It's a must. Must. And take someone with you. I know we say that all the time, but, you know, we are responsible for what happens in the future. So let's take that responsibility. The chair would now ask for a motion to adjourn.
I second.
It's been properly moved and seconded that we adjourn.